Welcome to episode 738 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today I am looking forward to speaking with our guest researcher, Dr. Magdalena Osburn. This episode is made possible with support from our sponsor, New England Biolabs. Listeners, are you curious how molecular biology is moving forward around the world? Hear from scientists who are driving discovery and expanding applications of existing technologies on the New England Biolabs podcast, Lessons from Lab and Life. Host Lydia Morrison interviews revered scientists working in genetics, synthetic biology, diagnostics, molecular cloning, and other fields. Get ready to explore the cutting edge of science and learn what these remarkable scientists have to offer. Don't miss out on the opportunity to hear exclusive stories about the world of laboratory research. Tune in to Lessons from Lab and Life today, wherever you listen to podcasts. And today, our guest Maggie is going to talk more about her life and science. So listeners, get ready to meet another one of our brilliant people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Magdalena Osburn. So, Maggie, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we are so happy to have you with us today, Maggie, and we're looking forward to hearing more about you and your research today. And listeners, I will start with a quick introduction here first. Maggie is an associate professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Northwestern University. She received her bachelor's degree in Earth and Planetary Sciences and Environmental Studies from Washington University in St. Louis. Afterwards, she enrolled in graduate school at the California Institute of Technology, where she earned her master's and Ph.D. degrees in geobiology from the Division of Geological and Planetary Sciences. Next, Maggie conducted postdoctoral research at the University of Southern California before joining the faculty at Northwestern University. Now, Maggie has received a number of awards and honors during her career. She was the recipient of a Packard Fellowship Award in 2017. She's recently received the Sulzman Award for Teaching and Mentoring from the American Geophysical Union. And she's also been named a CIFAR Fellow by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research and an AT&T Fellow by Northwestern University. And Maggie, today we're excited to get to know you as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not very busy doing science?
Well, I like to do a lot of things, but I also like to integrate my life and my science in a pretty high level. And so I am an earth scientist at my core. And so then very stereotypically, I like to do things like get out into nature. And so I like to go hiking and backpacking and go on big road trips to Montana and revel in the splendor of the mountains. But those are obviously pretty time intensive. And so you can't be doing them all the time. In terms of my home activities, I like to do yoga as sort of a sports activity I run. And then my big hobby is I'm a fiber artist. So I'm a big knitter, and you'll typically find me working on a big piece of lace somewhere.
That's awesome. So do you knit articles of clothing? What do you like to make?
Yeah, so I do some sweaters, but I really like lace. So I end up doing a fair number of shawls and things. And then I mostly give everything away. So I'm working on a shawl right now for a friend who just got a named professorship, which is sort of the pinnacle of fanciness in the academy. So I'm working on the pinnacle of fanciness in a shawl.
Oh, that is amazing. I love that heartfelt. You can feel the love that went into that gift. Well, Maggie, it sounds like you've got a lot of wonderful hobbies to keep you occupied outside of science. And you mentioned, of course, that you're an earth scientist at heart. So I'd love to talk about the work that you do in science. So how do you describe your work to someone who's not in your field or maybe not in research at all?
So it depends on people's backgrounds, how I describe what I do. I usually say I'm a cross between a microbiologist and a geologist. In reality, I have backgrounds in both. If I'm talking to people that are a little bit more science phobic, I usually say that I study weird microbes, or microbes that eat rocks is usually a pretty approachable term. So yeah, I work at the interface between multiple fields, and that's how I typically describe it.
I like it. And I think you are doing really exciting work. And I look forward to digging into some of the details as we go through our conversation. But I think in science, you need a healthy dose of motivation because there are a lot of challenges that you face in everyday life as a scientist. So do you have a favorite quote or a saying or something that really keeps you motivated, Maggie?
Yeah, I'd say I have a couple. One quote that's always resonated to me is "Well-behaved women seldom make history" by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. And I think it's not so much that I'm trying to make history or that I'm a poorly behaved woman, but I think the ethos behind this quote is that when you're coming from an underrepresented group into an arena that is a newer place for you to be, often those doors don't open themselves, and you often have to insert yourselves in places that may not have been accessible to you before. And so I think embodying that and learning from the strong feminist background that my mother raised me with has helped motivate me through time periods that have been a little more challenging, especially in my early career. The other thing that inspires me and sort of keeps me on track is my husband likes to say, stay humble, because I think we've all encountered academics, particularly senior academics, that are really ego-driven. And it's easy, especially in the world of traditional academia, where big labs have their own little fiefdoms. It's easy to sort of blow yourself out of control and think of it more as yourself as a big fancy scientist as opposed to this larger scale collaborative effort, which is what it really is in the end. So keeping the ego out of it and making sure my work remains true and question driven as opposed to being driven by who I am or how many people know my name. I think those are really important aspects that keep me moving.
Definitely. I think being driven by the science makes life a little bit easier than sort of being driven by the achievements and the accolades that sometimes come along with it, but sometimes don't.
Absolutely. And I will say that I have received some accolades in my career and I appreciate them when they do come. But for things that work out, so like proposals that have gotten funded versus those that haven't, I honestly think some of my best work are some of the things that hasn't gotten funded and hasn't gotten noticed, as opposed to some of those things that sail through. And I don't know what makes the difference, but it's important to see those values from your own perspective rather than how others view them.
Oh, absolutely. I'm so glad to hear you say that, Maggie, because I'm sure you are a role model for many of the people who are coming through the pipeline after you. But let's talk about your role models. You mentioned that sometimes people can help you get through this difficult journey that is science. So who are some of these role models or mentors or people that you've really looked up to in your career?
Yeah, I've been blessed to have some truly wonderful role models and mentors as I've been moving through, starting from a really young age. And so probably my first aspirational scientist figure is a guy named Everett Schock, who's faculty at Arizona State. And he's a geochemist, but I was able to join his crew in the field going to Yellowstone to do geomicrobiology. And he's A, a wonderful person, but B, really good at assembling teams of people who all do slightly different aspects of a larger scale project and really knitting together that interdisciplinary research. And that was something I got to observe before I was even a scientist, but really set sort of the tenor of how I like to do science now. So that was a really formative mentor, my undergrad advisor, Jan Amend, as well as the graduate student I worked with while I was an undergrad, Dr. Darcy Meyer-Dombard, who is now faculty at University of Illinois, Chicago. They really guided me and helped turn me into what I am. So taught me how to actually be a scientist instead of just aspire to be a scientist. And then from there, the mentorship squad, the Earth Science Women's Network has a really useful diagram, which is sort of the mentorship network, where you kind of fill in sort of the different aspects of your mentorship needs and identify who falls within those different categories. Kind of the getting away from the idea that your mentor is going to be like one sort of Yoda-like figure,
right,
and move into sort of the cloud of people who are actually helpful towards supporting the different aspects of you as a human being. So in grad school, I sort of diversified that network. And so my advisors, obviously, but also some of my friends from graduate school are my closest friends and colleagues now. I'd be remiss without mentioning my family. So my husband and my son, as well as my parents.
Oh, absolutely. I think this mentorship network or the support system that you build over the years really helps you get through the difficult points in your career. But I'd love to talk about where these scientific aspirations, as you call them, began for you, Maggie. So can you take us back to the beginning and share a little bit about what first got you interested in or excited about science?
In that regard, I was born with an advantage because I am the daughter of graduate students who met in graduate school.
Mhm.
So both of my parents have masters in geology, although my mom was an ER nurse for most of my life. My father is a geologist, so that meant that the ethos of our family vacationing and discussions and everything else was very scientific. And so I was really raised as a scientist. We didn't go to Florida to lay on the beach. That was never in our vacation portfolio. We went to Utah or parts of the American West for the most part. First thing we did when we got out there was find the nearest ranger station to get a geological map so that we would know what to call the formations we were looking at. Because how could you possibly look at a pretty rock without knowing what its name was?
Right. You must appreciate it fully.
And I still feel that way. I'm much more comfortable if I know the name of the formation.
Mhm.
My dad is also an avid caver and cave cartographer. So I started caving with him while I was in middle school, learning the science side of cave cartography. So that's basic survey techniques. So you use compass and clinometers and sketch to make cave maps. And that cartography skill set is actually what got me invited to go along on those trips to Yellowstone with Dr. Everett Schock. And so my dad brought me while I was in high school as his cartography assistant because he was brought along to go make maps of the hot springs. Everett's crew was sampling thermophiles and the water and the gases coming out of hot springs to try to make an integrative picture of the geochemical energy resources as well as the microorganisms that live within those sites. But they wanted to do it multiple years in a row. And they realized that much of the sampling that had been done before that was essentially without spatial context. And so it'd be like, oh, well, we sampled this spring. But if you look at a spring, that's a heterogeneous environment. And so my dad was brought on to make nice maps so that they could be like, we sampled right here in this spring. And then the next year we sampled right here in this spring. So I got to go as a cartography assistant for a couple of years. And then I showed interest in the chemistry side for the nuances of having the right graduate students at the right time. I ended up doing a lot of the chemistry for a few years there. That really got me hooked, sitting next to a hot spring, analyzing geochemistry in real time and being like, oh, wow, look at this one has a lot of sulfide and this one has a lot of iron. And look at these different microbes growing in these different sites. And my dad also took me out into the field. So he is the laboratory administrator. So he's laboratory staff at WashU in the Earth and Planetary Science Department, but he still maps part-time for the New Mexico Geological Survey. So I got to go out a couple of times and do real field geological mapping. And that was pretty amazing because even before I had any classes in geology, my dad offered to take me and I was like, well, I don't know anything about geology. Like, how can I help? I can read a topo map and hike, but what do I know? But essentially what we were trying to do is differentiate different units of some of the big tuffs. So the big volcanic deposits that are coming out of the Jemez caldera up there. And it was like, well, can you tell this rock apart from this rock? And it was like, yeah, I can see how they're similar and I can see how they're different. And it's like, perfect. Now walk the line where those two rocks touch and put it on your map. And that really was, oh, wow. Okay. So if you can tell the different things are different, then you can make a map or you can at least contribute to a map. And so kind of defined my approach to a lot of science. I'm often doing things that I feel like I don't actually know how to do because I think it's the right approach for a given question I'm trying to ask. But it all comes down to that. Can you tell these two things apart that are different? Kind of a running joke when I was at WashU as an undergrad that pretty much every Ph.D. thesis is proving that different things are different.
Right.
And it's not wrong, right?
Yeah.
So we're all working towards defining how those different things are different. And those are fundamental skills that I got from my upbringing.
I love that. And it sounds like you were battling imposter syndrome even at this early age where you were actually kind of the expert in that case.
To be fair, I did not know anything about rocks. I think sometimes people are experiencing imposter syndrome, but sometimes you really don't know what you're doing and are figuring it out as you go. But it's the question of whether or not that's an okay way to approach science. That's where the judgment calls go. And I would suggest that, yeah, we learn as we go.
So then what took you from this curious person and getting excited about science and being surrounded by geology to really starting to think about it being your own career path?
So in terms of thinking about what I wanted to do after high school, or even when I was in high school, I was already going to the field with real scientists at that point. I was on my third expedition to Yellowstone doing geochemistry by the time I was sitting there as a junior going, oh, what do I want to do? And I'd been going to colleges and looking around, and I thought I actually wanted to be a political scientist until I realized actually the things I'm doing in the summer, that's not just a hobby, that's a real interest. And so from there, I thought maybe I wanted to be a chemist because we all have to rebel in our own small ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to WashU because my father's not faculty, but I got to go there for deeply reduced tuition, which is very helpful in places like WashU. So I thought I was going to be a chem major, and they have a great chemistry department. And so I started along that track. But I realized that being in a smaller department, and particularly an earth science department, you have a level of access to active research that is essentially unavailable in larger chemistry departments and other sorts of departments. And it's true at WashU, and it's true here, where essentially the right interested undergrad wandering into my office can be doing research like in a couple of weeks. Whereas in the chemistry department, it was sort of like, okay, well, you're not going to do real research until you're doing your thesis, but for now, maybe you can wash these dishes. And there's nothing wrong with washing dishes. I still wash some of my own dishes, but being able to have an intellectual stake and be able to do something that was new and exciting and interesting is part of how I moved back into the geology department. And it was earth and planetary science. But I realized that I could do chemistry and I could do microbiology, but just on applied systems. And I could do them on things that were exciting. And I could take samples in Yellowstone, and I could take samples in shallow submarine vents in Italy. And the options were pretty extraordinary.
Absolutely. And then as you were getting involved in research and starting to think about next steps, how did you make that decision to go to Caltech?
So my advisor, my undergraduate advisor at the time, invited what would become my future advisor, Alex Sessions, to give a talk at WashU. And so I was able to meet Alex ahead of time and discuss our research interests and kind of know what I was getting into. So Caltech is a pretty, let's say, rigorous research institute. It's typically one of the top schools in the country. And it's hard. It is a hard place to be a graduate student. And it is certainly a place where I went from being someone that by the time I graduated my undergrad felt like I really knew what I was doing to feeling like I was the dumbest person in the room a lot of the time. Because, I mean, I had math and physics, but not at the caliber of the people I was interacting with at Caltech. And so you sort of had to find the things you were great at. One thing that drew me there, and so I spent my undergrad working in hydrothermal systems, and I was doing cultivation of high temperature living microorganisms in a lot of different conditions, and then working with DNA, doing things like sequencing genes and trying to get an understanding of diversity of those high temperature microbes in the systems and how that related to geochemistry. But I felt like in graduate school, I wanted to gain some new expertise with aspects of geology. So there really wasn't a lot of geology in what I'd been doing as an undergrad, beyond the fact that we were working in geothermally interesting environments. So I knew I wanted to sort of build my toolkit. So I wanted more fundamental geology and stratigraphy to be able to understand some of what I was being told about things like Earth history. And then I knew I wanted more lab-based skill sets that weren't just microbe dependent. And so I knew I wanted to get into the world of mass spectrometry and isotopes and trying to figure out what we could learn about microbes with other sorts of tools. And Caltech was a place that allowed me to really craft a program of research for what I wanted to do as my PhD that was unusually diverse. They have a system where you do independent projects with 2 advisors as part of your qualifying exams. That allowed me to start off working with 2 people. So Alex Sessions on the isotope organic geochemistry side, and then John Gratzinger on the geology side. And so I got to work with 2 very different professors who taught me 2 very different skill sets. And I was able to integrate them together. I was lucky enough to get an NSF Graduate Research Fellowship for my last 3 years of my PhD. That meant that when it came time to be like, okay, pick one, you have to be funded on some grant or another. It was like, well, now we have my own funding. And so I would like to continue to do both of these things in different ways.
Well, that's awesome. And then as you were wrapping up your graduate work, you then had to make that difficult decision where a lot of people are deciding, do you stay in academia? Do you get a postdoc? Where do you get a postdoc? How did you approach that decision and what brought you to USC?
I've always wanted to be faculty. because I was sort of raised in the department at WashU, I knew a lot of faculty. I knew what that job looked like. I knew aspects of the hierarchies and the positions of academia better than most. One of the inherent advantages and why you'll find a lot of faculty that have faculty parents, because there's a hidden curriculum there in terms of who everybody is, what they do, and how you get those jobs. So I was always very interested in it because I like the idea of being able to do my own research. And as a geoscientist, you can do research for companies, but often you don't get to frame the direction of that research always. And there are exceptions now, and there are a fair number of industry options that are better in that regard these days. But as I was finishing up, so I had a background in stratigraphy, and I was working with some petroleum companies associated with trying to understand stratigraphy of old rocks. So that was kind of an option, but deep down, I always wanted to be faculty. And I knew that that was sort of plan A. So as a graduate student, there was sort of a formative moment. I was on a listserv called IsoGeoChem, which is a great listserv if you're an isotope geochemist. Mostly we talk about how to fix mass spectrometers. It's like a question of like, has anyone ever seen this weird thing? Mm-hmm. But it's also a place that job ads get posted. So one day I was reading my IsoGeoChem digest, and there was this post from Northwestern advertising for this faculty position, and they wanted someone that had a background both in isotope organic geochemistry as well as deeper time Earth history questions of stratigraphy, which were sort of those two rogue components of my thesis. So I'm sitting there looking at this ad like, do they know me?
Right.
Like, could there really be many people that have both of these in their portfolio? And it turns out that there are plenty of people that have both of those in their portfolio, but it really spoke to me. I was like, wow, maybe this is the perfect place for me. And I was still a graduate student at this point. And so I kind of printed it out and I brought it into Alex Sessions' office and was like, look at this. And he was like, yeah, what about it? And he was like, well, should I apply? Am I allowed to apply? Can I do this? And he was like, yeah, try it. Can't hurt to try. You might get an interview. It'll be good practice. So I applied for that job when I was a sixth-year graduate student. I took 6 years to finish my Ph.D. A little hope for all those Ph.D. students out there that are thinking about taking that extra year. Sometimes you need it.
Right.
And yeah, I applied for the job and then I got a call. I got an interview. And it's like, what? Like, this is absurd. And so then I was like, this is great practice. So I'm going to go do this interview. I interviewed on Valentine's Day in February in Chicago. So then I did this interview and then I got the next call and I was like, well, we're going to make you an offer. And it's like, what?
Oh, wow.
So then I was like, well, I'm going to need to write my thesis. So then I was in the unique position of having a faculty position before I was finished with graduate school. I knew that I was not ready for that. So at least I had the introspection to be like, this is a bad idea. You should take a year. And all of my advisors advised me to do that as they sort of wore off their shock. And so it was like, okay, I need to do a postdoc. I need to think about where I want to take these sort of disparate lines of research and how I'm going to combine this and what my brand is going to be as a faculty member. So I applied for a bunch of things and looked around and reached out to my mentorship network. Again, so people I had known from being in the field in Yellowstone. I wrote a proposal with Everett. I wrote a proposal with Roger Summons at MIT, who's another organic geochemist. And of course, I didn't get any of those.
Oh, no.
Because time was of the essence and whatnot. But I also had reason to be in LA. So my partner at the time, we met when we were both at WashU. He was a graduate student. I was a undergraduate. And then we did a lot of long distance for a lot of years. And so two-body problems in various parts of the country. And he had finally managed to be in LA with me. Of course, right as I got to be finishing.
Right.
So we essentially decided it was like, well, if you can stay in LA, then stay in LA and we can make a year out of it. And then we can sort of figure out how to make this two-body problem work somewhere else. And I was lucky in that regard because my undergraduate mentor, Jan Amend, had in the intervening time that I had gotten a PhD, moved from WashU to USC. So I was actually able to work with the same person, although doing very different things. And so USC turned out to be a great fit. Jan had a big NASA Astrobiology Institute funded there that was really focused on the deep subsurface biosphere. And that really became the subject of a lot of my subsequent work. So I hadn't worked in the deep subsurface prior to that. I'd worked in hot springs, and we always sort of viewed hot springs and springs in general as portals into the deep subsurface. So like windows where you could see a little bit of that subsurface signature, but with an overprinting of what was happening on the surface. But this was an opportunity to actually go to that deep subsurface and think about what really lives deep underground. And so it was a whole new sort of field area and conceptually different microbes. And a lot of working in those spaces is really different. But Jan knew from my time with him as an undergrad that I knew how to plan a field expedition. I knew how to take the kind of samples we needed to take. I knew how to do some of the modeling and calculations we needed to make. So he was like, okay, great. You can do a quick postdoc here. And what I need you to do is kickstart this field campaign because I know you know how to do that. And then you can get a foothold in this deep underground space. And that's a win-win for everybody. And that turned out to be just a really fantastic opportunity to get into sort of a new avenue of geomicrobiological research.
Oh, that's awesome. And now you've been at Northwestern for a number of years and you've got an amazing lab. So I want to make sure we talk about some of your current projects. So Maggie, what is a project that you are working on right now that you are just the most excited about?
There's a lot going on right now. I've been here just long enough to, my lab, I feel like has reached sort of the maximum size that I can manage it. Mm-hmm. And that means that I have 25 balls in the air at any time and I'm an expert juggler. It's like plate spinning. You just put effort into each project as it's about to fall off the rails.
Mm-hmm. As long as you're keeping them going. Yeah,
that's right. And occasionally we crash and burn somewhere, but story for another day. So a couple of things that I'm really excited about on that topic of the deep subsurface research stuff I started as a postdoc. I've continued along with that research and really expanded it. And so I've been working in the former Homestake gold mine since I was a postdoc. So Black Hills of South Dakota, we're able to go down in these deep old rocks in a facility that is maintained just for science. And so most of the science that happens at, it's called the Sanford Underground Research Laboratory, is high energy particle physics. So they put big detectors down there and argon is firing some sort of particles at them and things I don't understand are happening. But it's maintained such that we can go there and we can take samples and we can set up long-term experiments to look at the microbiology that inhabits these deep underground aquifers where they intersect the mine. And so we're using the mine as access and then we can study the life that lives there. So I've been doing a lot of different types of work and had some great students come through working on deep mine projects. We just had a paper published like last week, I guess, that was my former postdoc, Lily Momper. And we did some larger scale DNA sequencing of these sites that we refer to as the Deep Mine Microbial Observatory. And so this is a network of boreholes that span from 800 feet deep all the way down to almost 5,000 feet deep.
Oh, wow.
So a kilometer and a half deep underground. And we have a gradient of sites. And the newest paper is compiling this sort of deep sequencing where we sequence all the DNA we can find and we assemble that back into genomes, which is essentially like making a microbe based on their DNA and using computers to do that reassembly. But it's really exciting because instead of just looking at sort of sequences that tell you who's home, you can actually see the DNA for what they can do. And so what sorts of metabolisms might be happening and how those vary with different sites. That's a really exciting paper for me to come out because I feel like we've learned something about the physiology of the organisms that live deep underground. And so now what I'm working on now, the time point that we took those samples for what's called metagenomics was in the middle of a long 4-year time series where we were going every, say, somewhere between 2 and 5 months to this network of sites and collecting the same suite of samples. And that's the kind of thing you really can't do in the deep, deep subsurface because if you're in a standard operational mine, you often don't have access to sites because they've been mined away. That's sort of the power of working in this kind of facility that's stable. So we could actually do this time series. And I've been sort of languishing on publishing this because I'm trying to figure out there are some microbes that really are there all the time and they seem to be really stable. And there's other populations that are much more variable. But framing the why and the explanation for those different sorts of organisms has been a little hard to put together. But now we have these genomes. And so now what I'm doing is I'm linking those genomes to the taxa that I see changing and also not changing within these communities over time. And so there, it's going to be a story of understanding why some of these organisms are really variable and what they might be responding to. Whereas what's fueling these organisms that are really stable, that seem to be part of this core microbiome. That's what I'm working on right now in the deep mine work. And I'm really excited. I'm putting that paper together right now. So assuming I can make some code work in the next few days, we'll make some progress with that before Christmas. It wasn't working so well yesterday, but we'll do better today.
You've got this.
Every day is a fresh start.
Well, Maggie, this is really exciting research. And listeners, if you want to hear about even more exciting science, New England Biolab's podcast, Lessons from Lab and Life, is your source for staying informed about the most up-to-date molecular biology breakthroughs. Host Lydia Morrison interviews prominent scientists and delves into their research to uncover how their findings affect society in meaningful ways. Tune in to learn from the experts and get a glimpse of the cutting-edge advancements being made by scientists around the globe. Don't miss out on your opportunity to gain new knowledge and stay informed on the latest discoveries. Tune in to Lessons from Lab and Life today, wherever you listen to podcasts. And Maggie, of course, as you hinted, there are challenges. Whether you're battling the code or just juggling a ton of things all at once, you're bound to drop something and something is going to fail. So talking about these failures, I think, is really important in science because a lot of people don't see them. They just see that finished product. So do you have a story of one of your own failures or challenges that you could tell us about?
I think the thing to emphasize is that the failures are far more common than the successes. And you just have to maintain a sense of humor about it. I mean, I'm a person that grows microbes that are really challenging to grow, which means that the vast majority of what we try to grow dies or something else grows instead.
Right.
You get contaminated by some weed. And yes, there are weed microbes. And I also work with mass spectrometers, which are just notoriously finicky and essentially always broken.
Mm-hmm.
So the times that work are few and far between. And so you really have to celebrate those wins. I joke that I have the memory of a goldfish these days, and it's in part true, and it's also partly intentional because it's a really good thing to forget the struggle and to just celebrate the wins when they work out and just be like, it was a process. It took 3 years. Had everything been working great, maybe the entirety of the project could have been done in 6 months. But if it was doable in 6 months, if it was easy, then everyone would do it. That's what I tell my students. It's like, if this were easy, then someone would have already done it. And that's my motivational speaker hat. And, sometimes they believe me and sometimes I think they don't. But I think that's the case, right? There were chunks of my PhD where the mass spec I needed to make the data that I needed was broken for years. And I was trying to fix it for years. But, in that process, I rebuilt every part of that mass spec. And so I know how that thing works inside and out in a way that many people don't. So from every failure, you learn something. Mostly. Some things are just demotivated and fail for reasons beyond your control. But for a lot of things that don't work in science, you learn something from those failures and from the process of getting out of that hole. And I think that makes you a stronger scientist. I know that makes me a stronger scientist. It's just the challenge is maintaining motivation and maintaining your spirit through those time periods where it's not going so great.
Absolutely. So how do you maintain the morale in the lab when things are going poorly?
So I remember one day in the field when I was like 14 years old with Everchalk and it's raining and we're sitting in the parking lot. It's a van full of graduate students and scientists. I don't even know. And it's raining and he's trying to convince us to go outside and take these samples and do our chemistry. And he did an incredible rendition of Jackson 5 ABC 1, 2, 3 in like falsetto.
Oh, wow.
And I will never forget that because we all got out of the van. And so sometimes as a leader of a group, you have to be an absurd cheerleader, right? You have to just get in there and just be like, this is going to work. We're going to make this fun, right? And so every mass spectrometrist I know has some sort of weird superstition and or shrine associated with their lab. Right. And you'll see these. If you do our mass spec labs, there's always some sort of weird little doll or figurine or something. It's like, oh, what's that? It's like, that's the shrine. So we have some baby Yodas. The baby Yodas take offering of tinfoil balls. And so when things are really grim, you donate some tinfoil balls to the baby Yodas and wish upon a star and move on with your day. That's flippant, but just trying to be the biggest cheerleader I can be. And that, of course, is a mental load in itself. And that requires that I have my own cheerleaders. So one of my best friends in life from grad school is a woman named Kristen Bergman, who's faculty at MIT. We do a lot of co-cheerleading. We're texting every day to talk about our writing, what worked, what didn't, what's terrible, what's great. So having someone who gets it, who's like on your side, who will pump you up when you need it, tell you you're being dumb when you need it, tell you to drop it when you need it, that's just incredibly important. Having people in my group, I now have a really good friend in my group. His name is Brad Stevenson. So he's a research faculty member, which now means my group is kind of a super group. It's sort of like mom and dad in the group, which makes for kind of a funny dynamic. And he's also a fun and pretty upbeat person. So we just try to keep it light, and we try to make sure that someone is always on their game and someone is pumping up the group. And that means it's okay for me to have a day where I'm down and where I'm not pumping people up, because I know that there are other people around that can take on that mantle.
Absolutely. I think surrounding yourself with positive people can go a long way. And you mentioned, of course, that you do take the time to celebrate all of the successes, because sometimes there's a bit of a drought. So do you have a favorite success story, Maggie, that you'd like to tell us about?
I think the most gratifying successes for me as a faculty member now is when my students do something great. I think the feeling of pride I feel when each of my graduate students have defended, that's kind of indescribable. And then when my students have really big wins, I think I feel those more than my own. So my first student, Jamie McFarland, got a faculty job. She's at the University of Wyoming. She recently had a big flashy paper come out talking about methane cycling in Greenlandic lakes. And that's a paper that we have been working on literally since she was a second-year graduate student. That was a long time ago. So when that came out for her, I think I was most excited about that paper beyond an excitement I felt over any of my own like first author papers, because it's just like you see that effort. I saw that whole struggle, lines of inquiry, new research direction to try to put the pieces together, new ideas, stitching it all together. And then finally it's out and it's great. So I think when my students do well and achieve what they're trying to achieve, I think those are my biggest wins these days.
Absolutely. I think this mentoring and sort of being a part of someone else's career path is really exciting and rewarding in science.
Yeah, I mean, I have pictures. So if you look above my computer, there's a picture of Kaylin Kazar, who is my second PhD student to defend. She had to do it by Zoom because of COVID. But it's a picture of the two of us side by side on Zoom with party hats because another one of my students lived close to her. So I sent down like a party pack of party hats and champagne and food and stuff so that we would be ready to have sort of our remote partying. That picture is above my head, that smile on her face, that helps motivate me. And behind me on my wall, I've got pictures of other students in various stages of graduating. And it keeps you motivated to see people achieve their dreams.
Absolutely. And I think this motivation and inspiration can keep you moving, like you said, but also encourage you to work even harder in science. And it can sometimes take over your life a little bit. So we do try to encourage our listeners to take a step back, make sure they've got some balance, and maybe read something outside of their own specific area of expertise. So do you have a book that you'd recommend, whether it's related to science or completely outside of science, that we can add to our own reading lists?
Of course. I read a lot. I'm sort of like a random factoid generator. People joke about this, in part because if I don't read something that's not my own science, I don't sleep. So these things are related. So being able to give yourself a break and give yourself some mental space. Also, it helps with your mental health. It helps me sleep. So I read a lot almost every night. One set of books that was really formative, and so I read it a long time ago, is Annals of the Former World by John McPhee. John McPhee was a journalist, but went out with a bunch of geologists. And so that's one of the most approachable but accurate, really amazing narrative of how this country got put together and aspects of the geology in sort of the form of a road trip. And it's really just a beautiful narrative, and it's really well written. If your listeners have not read Annals of the Former World or any of the subcomponents of that compendium, they should. One that I just finished, which is really good, is about fungi, called Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. And that is just a really fascinating view of how important fungi are in different aspects of both the environment, the wood wide web. So this notion that like fungal associated tree symbionts are like talking to each other across soils, and various aspects of how humans use fungi and just how important they are in different aspects. So that one was a really cool book I read recently.
Oh, awesome. Well, Maggie, thank you for these great recommendations. We will add them to our website for our listeners to find there. And I think we've hinted throughout our discussion that you've had these opportunities to travel for your science, to go to different places for training or to go to different field sites. So do you have a favorite place that your science has taken you?
I have so many favorites. I love that aspect of what I do. So being able to go do fieldwork in these like weird and wonderful locations. Yellowstone was obviously that has a special place in my heart because that's where I started doing science. The most far afield, so I did a fair amount of my Ph.D. work on the stratigraphy side, so understanding how carbonate rocks are deposited in the time period right before the Cambrian explosion, so in the Ediacaran. I worked in Oman, the country of Oman, so taking me to the Middle East. And there are some beautifully preserved rocks there that are hanging out on the Central Coast in the desert. Sand dunes everywhere, sand and rocks and just not even cactus. So that was pretty amazing. We've been working in some truly strange lakes in British Columbia that are hypersaline, but they have this weird spotted appearance. And so there are all these separate brine pools. So I don't know. I love every place differently and every place is different. I'm really lucky that I get to go to them.
Oh, I think that's awesome. And I think in addition to the travel opportunities, which are phenomenal in science, you get to work with some really wonderful people. And you've talked about a few of them throughout the course of our conversation. And I think this human side of science is something that not a lot of people get to see as well, because I think oftentimes there are these stereotypes of how scientists are portrayed in the media, and they're just not correct. So do you have an example of a story, Maggie, or just maybe a quirky tradition or a funny memory that you've shared with colleagues that goes contrary to some of the stereotypes that people may still have about scientists?
Well, I mean, I think I've covered some that are pretty ridiculous. So the lab shrine, the baby Yodas, I will say we name all of our mass spectrometers. So our two big isotope mass spectrometers are Beyonce and Lizzo.
Awesome.
And then my organic machine where we identify organics in different compounds is Rihanna. And recently our newest acquisition is Tay, which is a Headspace GC. And that one got to be Taylor Swift because it's red. And so it's got this nice red cover. And so we went so far as to bedazzle it. And it now says Tay. So we anthropomorphize all of our instruments. So when something is wrong with Rihanna, we refer to her by name. All of the instruments being named after divas, I think, is fitting and would probably be funny to someone listening to Lab Group Meeting where I ask about them by name. It's like, okay, so how's Beyonce doing today? Lizzo's been broken for months. So
she's on break. Yeah,
she's on break.
So who gets to name each of the pieces of equipment as they come into the lab? Is this your responsibility? It's a heavy burden.
No, usually this is a student consensus, although I will say that I pulled a little weight in the naming of Tay. There was a move for it to be Cardi B. I just felt like Taylor Swift was having a moment. It was time. And the red outfit was appropriate.
Oh, that is amazing. And I think that does, like we said, go against some of the stereotypes of just this serious, critical nature of scientists, because you have this sense of humor. You like to make things fun. And I think that's a really important thing to have in the lab, this sense of community camaraderie and these inside jokes that you share, because you're tackling some big questions in science. And we know that there's always limitations, right? Maggie, whether it's funding, staff, technology, time, or just the feasibility of the projects that you really want to tackle. So if we took away the barriers that normally hold you back, what is the one question that you would want to answer most?
I'm really excited right now about understanding the diversity of the subsurface biosphere. And we're limited in that we only get little portals into that biosphere from sort of the pinpricks we're able to make as people on Earth. So it's like I can go take some samples in a mine. I can go take some other samples in like a different state from groundwater well. But getting that bigger picture is a big logistical effort. I think if I had $3 million or something like that, I haven't priced it out, but you'd have to make some element of crowdsourcing of drinking water wells and deep aquifers and different systems and really trying to get a much more holistic picture of the deep subsurface biosphere across a continental landmass. I think that's what I would tackle because I think it's an answerable problem. It's something where you could really understand the spatial gradients. You could look at it in chemical context as well, but it's limited by manpower and by dollars. And so I could say like, oh, well, I want to go walk around on Mars and drill a 10-kilometer deep hole on Mars and see if there's extant life. But I don't think that's doable, at least not in my lifetime. So I think that's the one that I think I could answer with sufficient funding and cooperation and permits and whatnot.
Absolutely. And you hinted at some of the potential impacts for this work, and that some of the places you would potentially be sampling are wells and things that affect people's drinking water. And I think this is really important just to understand what is in these wells.
Well, and I think it's a really interesting dynamic that intersects with the anthropogenic sphere. And with my time so I'm part of a CIFAR group called Earth 4D. That is a really diverse group of scholars thinking about the deep subsurface from the aspect of chemistry, energy, and life, both in the modern, in deeper time, and then also on other planets. And so really interdisciplinary. But we often talk about the notion of the competition for space in the subsurface, which I imagine is not something most of your listeners have thought about, is that you think about this sort of vast underground space. You don't think about it at all. And that's the point of it. But in sort of the modern era, we do a lot of heavy lifting in the subsurface in general, which can affect the biosphere. So we have a paper, a man named Grant Ferguson, who's a hydrologist, is leading it, thinking about the expression of the Anthropocene, this modern human-influenced period of time, on subsurface fluid flow and chemistry. And it turns out that the fluxes both in and out of water into the subsurface now by people are bigger than any natural input or output from the subsurface. So we're already overwhelming those natural fluxes, and we're going to do so more in the future. So pretty much every climate mitigation solution you can name, or many of them, involve injecting things into the subsurface. So we're doing CO2 sequestration, we're doing hydrogen storage. We're also increasingly dependent on fossil water. And so that's what it is when you drill a deep groundwater well and are using it to irrigate, say, corn. This is how a lot of the Midwest irrigates. These are old waters. That is a non-renewable resource. So there are challenges with space and how we emphasize recharging aquifers so that we have steady drinking water and agricultural water supplies versus what happens when you inject all of this carbon into the subsurface. Can you count on microbes not to do something bad with it, like make methane, which they can do? So trying to study some of those aspects of what happens when it gets a little crowded in the subsurface biosphere and how we deal with those outcomes moving forward.
Well, I think this is tremendously important work, and we appreciate you covering a lot of ground with us in this interview today, but I'd love to end with advice, Maggie. So what is the best piece of advice that you have ever been given that you can share with listeners today?
So when I submitted my very first proposal, my then postdoc advisor, Jan Amend, said, okay, great. Now forget that it happened. I was like, what? I'm going to be checking the portal every day. And he's like, nope, pretend it didn't happen. Because if it works out, then that's going to be an incredible surprise because you've forgotten about it. And if it doesn't, because chances are it won't, then it'll just be another email in your inbox. So for things that have a high probability of failing, which is the case for essentially every grant I write, for many papers I submit, for a lot of things. And this will be true of people who are applying to grad school. You're not going to get in most places. You're not going to get the fellowships. I get many times more rejections than I get acceptances. Being able to sort of maintain some emotional distance from the things that you're applying for has been one of the keys to sort of maintaining my sanity through this process. And so I'd say for people trying to cut it in science, the rejection is fierce. Being able to just pivot is really key.
I love that. I think that's wonderful advice, Maggie, and just not fretting about things once they're out of your control. Once they leave your hands, it's in someone else's, and don't worry about it.
And it's hard because literally paying my people,
right?
Like having my whole lab group have their paychecks. Those are the stakes, right? So it's not a small amount of pressure. And so you have to have strategies to deal with that.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate you sharing that advice. Is there any last piece of advice or a last note of inspiration that you would like to end our conversation on today?
When I'm looking for inspiration, I think the best place to find that is to just go outside. It doesn't matter where you go, but find yourself a forest, find yourself a place, smell the smells and see the things. And don't forget to look at the small things. So if you're sitting in the forest, don't forget to look really closely at the soil or really closely at a leaf and see how different things are different. And you might find some inspiration there.
I love it. Wonderful note to end on, Maggie. And if our listeners want to learn more about you and the work that you do, what is the best way for them to do so?
Well, there aren't many Magdalena Osburns out there, and there aren't many that are geomicrobiologists. So you can just Google me and you will come across my research website. I have a page on our Northwestern departmental website We are active on Instagram as well as, we'll just call it Twitter.
Right.
And yeah, so you can find us on the internet, but I am readily findable to find my email if you are so inclined.
Oh, fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely check out that website. Take some time to learn more about Maggie and the wonderful work that she and her lab members do. And Maggie, it's been such a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for doing this. I think it's really important to hear the stories behind the scientists. And so I appreciate the work you do.
Oh, well, thank you. And wonderful, of course, to have you here. And listeners, you as well. We hope you'll join us for our next episode of People Behind the Science.